It gives me great pleasure to introduce Doctor, Professor, Teacher, Author, Specialist, Human Being, Great Warmth, definitely not a saint. Dr. Michael O'Loughlin, we are so proud to have you here. We are so grateful for your presence.
I asked my shoes so short. She said she'd have her shoes off.
Your talk is... Now, that's even more wonderful. I love those talks where you don't know what you're going to say.
I do.
You do.
I don't know what
Come
it's
and
called.
say it.
Okay. Thank you.
He's so wonderful, it doesn't worry me.
Actually, Norma doesn't know, but I prepared 90 minutes. And I'll cut it to an hour, so it's not too long. How's that? That's not a joke. It's a real privilege to be here, and I'd like to begin with 3 acknowledgements. First one, of course, to the ancestral owners of the land in Australia, because it's important we acknowledge the people who originally owned this land. Secondly, in the 1840s in Circular Quay, a number of ships came in from Ireland, and they carried on those ships 4,500 orphans and destitute girls, aged from 14 to 17. Those girls were marched right up Macquarie Street to the Hyde Park Barracks, and some were taken to an island. What's the island called that has the art show on it now? Cockatoo. They were taken to Cockatoo Island as well. And in fact, I'm not sure if it's still there, but last year when I was here in Hyde Park Barracks, they had an exhibit memorializing those girls. Somewhat sanitized, but still very interesting. So I'd like to remember those people of Irish origin who contributed to the formation of this society, especially those girls who came here very young and were brought here as wives for convicts. And thirdly, I'd like to acknowledge that we all build our work on genealogies and mentors. And my work in trauma and my work with children has been built on a series of mentors. And I was very astonished 2 days ago to get a note from Norma to say that Judy Atkinson was going to be here, because I've never met Judy, but her book was very formative in my thinking. And it's a pleasure to meet Judy and I actually want to speak about her work a little bit, so it's rather risky business, but I'll try. But if you haven't read Judy Atkinson's Trauma Trails, I strongly recommend it as a way of understanding the complexity of the issues with which we speak here. So with that said, I'd like to begin. I have really 3 goals that I'd like to accomplish here today. I'd like to give you an opportunity to think about 3 things. The first one is autobiography, the second one is group story, and the third one is pedagogy. And I've prepared a set of questions, enough questions to keep you talking for a long time if I decided to stop, but since I won't, it won't matter. But enough questions that focus on your own autobiographical origins, and questions that focus on your experience of the intergenerationality of trauma in the lives of the children with whom you work, and then questions about the pedagogical environment that's created in the facility in which you work, and ways in which that might be enhanced and improved. It's a little presumptuous because I have never visited any of your schools, and I have no idea what you're dealing with. I do work with children who are traumatized a lot, but I have never seen your facility, so you'll have to excuse me if I have errors in my thinking and correct me as we go along. I'd like to begin actually with a quote from Trauma Trails, Judy Atkinson's book. And Judy says in her book, facilitators of healing must therefore know themselves. As Mary discovered, quote, and this is an interview with one of the people she spoke to, my expectations were to just get some tools to help our mob. I wasn't counting on all that stuff coming up for me and having to work through it. I don't think it really occurred to me that I would have to work on myself first before I could help my mob. The requirement that I enter a personal analysis, I'm a psychoanalyst, and one of the requirements is you have to go into therapy for 1,000 years. caused me great trepidation when I began training. I felt profoundly vulnerable. Throughout my life, as I have noted in my writings, I had a feeling akin to what Bion calls nameless dread. The possibility of confronting dreaded aspects of my own experience made me very anxious. Gradually, however, I made the transition to thinking about my life emotionally and not just intellectually, and that resulted in a book called The Subject of Childhood a few years ago. And part of that book is devoted to an exploration of my own history. At first, I was interested only in the details of my own childhood and the origins of my own anguish. I talk in the book, for instance, about my struggle with becoming a writer and how this seemed to be related to my father's lack of facility in either reading or writing. He was kicked out of school at age 7 or 8 to work on the teacher's farm, to prepare him for a life as a farm worker. And he got no education. The only boy in the class that got an education was the teacher's son, who was destined to become a doctor. And my father had terrible shame because he had never received the education necessary to learn to read and write comfortably. In the book, too, I speak of the abject poverty and the emotionally harsh climate in which both of my parents were raised. While working on the book, I decided to speak with my mother about my childhood, and inevitably this turned into a conversation about her own childhood. Here is a brief fragment from the story of my mother. During my mother's childhood, tuberculosis was rampant in Ireland. My mother was born in 1926. She's still alive. She's 87 now. Since the disease was highly contagious, and since this was prior to the development of a vaccine, contraction of the disease was a death sentence, and sufferers were isolated in facilities known as workhouses. At the youthful age of 30, having 3 children under 10, my mother's mother went to hospital to deliver her 4th baby and was then transferred directly to the workhouse, where she died in due course from tuberculosis. My mother had one recollection of her mother prior to her illness. That was when she baked a cake for the children for some occasion. I can't remember her face, she said, but I remember pure kindness. She also recalls one visit to see her mother in the workhouse, but all she can remember is tears. We're having this conversation over Scrabble because she can't have the conversation without being busy. My mother's older sister, aged 10, having eavesdropped on her father making plans to put the children in an orphanage after their mother's death, smuggled a letter into the workhouse to inform their mother of his intentions. Her mother then made their father swear to raise the children himself. In view of what we have since learned about Irish orphanages of the period, this was a most fortunate outcome. The estimate is that in Ireland between 1900 and 1990, 60,000 children were sexually abused in religious institutions. It's really quite incredible, 60,000. The children were never told of their mother's impending death. Rooting through a chest of clothing at home one day, the children found what they thought was a brown dress. When they asked their father about it, he told them go ask their grandmother. She harshly told them it was the habit in which their mother was to be buried. When their mother finally died, the children were not even told. When I asked if any process was put in place to assist the children in mourning, this is what psychologists do when they interview their parents. What kind of process was put in place? My mother looked at me in amazement for making such a naive inquiry. It was awful hard. I can't think of anything like it. Every time we heard that someone died, I felt like I was going to vomit. It had an awful effect on us. Don't talk about it. The regimen of domestic servitude and deprivation only intensified afterwards, until finally she and her sister were old enough to enter domestic service for other families. So in my mother's family, we have generations of a family of rural Irish people, victims of severe deprivation and suffering in the present, and bearers of untold trauma from a famine, which I'll speak up more about in a moment, and apparently incapable of providing any kind of psychological sustenance for my mother and her siblings, who had suffered such catastrophic losses. There was a certain hardness in the Ireland of my youth and earlier when it came to children's emotions. This is evident, for example, in Frank McCourt's widely read book, Angela's Ashes, a work that was received in parts of Ireland with considerable resentment and was actually burned publicly in County Limerick. Writing in 1991, Anthony Clare, one of Ireland's leading psychiatrists who died recently, quotes another Irish psychiatrist on Irish child-rearing habits and says the following: "The family home in Ireland is a novitiate for violence. Even from the cradle, the child is meant to feel rejection, hostility, and physical pain. The infant is left to cry in his cot because his mother doesn't want to, quote, give in to him. Later he is smacked with a hand or a stick. He's meant to go to bed early. He's not allowed to have his tea. He's put in a room by himself. And in order to invite this morale-breaking treatment from his parents, all the Irish child has to do is to be normal. It is the normality of childhood that sets parents' teeth on edge. They take no joy in childishness. And any of you who were raised in Irish origin homes might resonate with some of that comment. Sitting with my mother and attempting to wrap my mind around the nature of her unmourned losses was an unforgettable experience for me. Part of my heaviness of heart undoubtedly came from my empathy with my mother's legacy of suffering, and part no doubt from the realization that my subjectivity was formed in the crucible of my mother's losses. I also marvel that despite her upbringing, and contrary to my father's more incommunicative and heavy-handed approach, my mother managed to transcend her pain and raise her children with fortitude, love, and empathy. I had set out simply to fill in some of the missing gaps in my own childhood history. However, listening to my mother's resigned acceptance of suffering and wincing at her stoic philosophy that you just bury the pain and go on, a posture on pain that's very familiar to me, I began to wonder if indeed there was larger meaning in her story. I began to think about my father's frightening panic attacks, we didn't know the name for them in those days, and about the alcoholism and mental disturbance in his family. Could there be more to these events than meets the eye? My thoughts turned to the Great Hunger, a catastrophic famine that swept through Ireland from 1845 through 1847. This is the time the orphan girls were taken to Australia. That awful catastrophe was not a famine, properly speaking. There's well-established evidence that the British colonial rulers exported Irish livestock and wheat, while 1 million Irish peasants died, and 3 more million fled on ships that were known as coffin ships, because many died at sea. 2 to 3 million people fled and many died in steerage. It was a genocide of catastrophic proportions, sliced the Irish population from 8 million to 4 million in 15 years. And anybody here who is descended from somebody of Irish origin who left Ireland any time after 1800 were almost certainly a victim of either the Great Hunger or one of the many preceding famines during that period. Now, I just want to give you one brief story about the famine experience because I find it very interesting. This is a story of a US journalist called Carolyn Ramsey, who works for a gossip magazine called People magazine in the US. She offers a very interesting account of the workings of hungry ghosts in her daily life. Having discussed how her grandmother, an immigrant child of famine survivors, developed an obsession for feeding sandwiches to imaginary people in her old age, Ramsey began to ruminate on her own, quote, need to feed. And here's what Carolyn Ramsey says about how she became obsessed with food. I don't know another working mother who worries about feeding people the way I do. It has taken me years, on the other hand, to focus on just feeding my own family and not the whole world. On late nights when I've pounded chicken and chopped vegetables alone in my kitchen while my family sleeps, I've wondered precisely what my problem is. Part of me passes off the feeding urge as a slightly embarrassing compulsion, although its emotional depth and power suggest otherwise. After dropping food at a soup kitchen for the first time a decade ago, I had to steer my car to the side of the street because I was sobbing so hard I couldn't see. There's such unremitting sadness at the root of this drive to feed people that I've come to assume that it links me somehow to the dark events in Ireland in the 1800s. I can't know this for sure. No famine stories made their way from my great and great-grandparents to me, or even to my parents. The Irish aren't real talkers, my mother once said. When I consider how my grandmother's need to feed imagined ghosts has followed me for 30 years, though, it seems likely her famine-surviving parents' attitudes towards food made a deep impression on her. How could they not? And I just want to give you a couple of quotes from my childhood that echo. I'll be talking briefly about silence as one of the great mechanisms of transmission of trauma. And these are refrains from my Irish childhood. Mind your own business. A closed mouth catches no flies. What you don't know won't trouble you. Wrong. What's it to you anyway? What do you want to know that for? Sure, isn't that all in the past? What are they talking about that for anyway? And then this last one, after my book came out causing considerable anguish in my family, can't you just be happy with the life you have now? So my first question to you, and I have 2 sheets of paper, which I'll hand out to you there in the corner over there. One has a set of 5 or 6 questions to help you think about some of these issues, and the other one that has a long set of more detailed questions. First question I'd like to pose for you is, how much do you own your own family and ancestral history? And in what ways is your history an asset in working with Aboriginal children? And in what ways might it get in your way? Now, the next section of my paper is called The Nature of the Wound, and it focuses on three thinkers, Judy Atkinson, who's present here, Louise Kaplan, and somebody else. I'm not going to talk about trauma at great length unless I take the 90 minutes. However, I would like to draw a couple of thoughts from Judy Atkinson to begin with. Judy described the traumatic consequences of cutting off spiritual and social links this way. And I guess that's my biggest message, is to not recognize trauma as only about physical insult or verbal insult, but as about the severance of spiritual and social linkages to community and to land and to people. Judy says, the willful denigration and destruction of Aboriginal ceremonial responsibilities and processes by the colonizers has therefore had profound transgenerational effects on the people of this land. Aboriginal people have been prevented from engaging in ceremonial processes for healing from trauma. The distress feelings that accompany loss, death, and devastation remain as destructive forces within the land and the people. Now, Judy later introduces a concept that's a key concept for me and has been most influential in my thinking, and that's the concept of lore, L-O-R-E. And Judy says, lore is defined as the body of traditional knowledge based on the wisdom that comes from experience and transmitted in practical teaching across generations. And then she talks about the absence of lore, which Judy calls lorelessness. In traumatized populations, lore collapses. Environments and the relationships within them become chaotic and unstructured. They collapse into lorelessness. Cultural genocide, she says, is when people come to believe that they themselves are of no value, that their cultural traditions and practices are inferior, and hence so are they. They are non-persons with no value. And that, to me, is the essence of trauma. Can we accept then that all of us are surrounded by ghosts, and that wounded Aboriginal children carry a huge ghostly inheritance from the long litany of suffering their families and peoples have endured? Now, I'd like to shift to another thinker whose work is quite complementary to this, and this is two writers called Rosenman and Handelsman, who have studied the Holocaust. And they talk about the notion of group story, which is another version of the same idea. Rosenman and Handelsman talk about shame and helpless rage experienced by Holocaust survivors. Quote, for 2,000 years, this community has endured negative mirroring from oppressors who constantly remind them of their inferiority. The pervasively bad self-feelings spur a continual search for good enough mirroring to make restitution. This yearning focuses on the offspring. It becomes the child's obligation to compensate for their parents' negative self-feelings. And that, for those of us who work with children, is a very complicated problem indeed. Noted writer Selma Freyberg said it this way: the sad and distant face of the mother was mirrored in the sad and distant face of the baby. The room was crowded with ghosts. Now, Louise Kaplan is another scholar that's really helped me in her. She studied trauma considerably. Her book, No Voices Ever Wholly Lost, is very good. And she talks about the Holocaust in particular in parts of her book. And she focuses on the issue of the child who becomes preoccupied with the unspoken anguish of the parent, and then instead of being able to pursue their own developmental pathway, veers off the developmental pathway to absorb the parent's preoccupation, and therefore becomes traumatized. And here's a quote from one of my own earlier writings about Louise Kaplan's work. The puzzling question, as Kaplan notes, is how a child in the presence of a parent who either refuses to speak of a trauma or who cannot speak of the trauma because it has been dissociated or else received as a blank legacy from ancestors, nonetheless comes to embody their parents' suffering. The answer appears to be that the blankness in parental affect elicits a caretaking response from the child. And if you work with children and you have a child who's especially helpful, you need to be very careful about the helpfulness of a child, the over-helpfulness. You know, the one that people say, a pleasure to have in class, always very helpful, a little red flag to worry about. The answer appears to be that the blankness in parental affect elicits a caretaking response from the child. This can be detected, Kaplan notes, in the disproportionate space that the parent occupies in the child's mind. Children who refuse school, for example, often do so because of concern for a parent looms so large that the child simply cannot dare to leave her side. The parentified child suppresses the possibility of articulating a desire for its own growth. Are we out of time? Crap. No. 90 minutes. All right, I'll skip to the last section. Seriously?
What you're doing.
Okay. 90 minutes?
Keep going.
I'll go on more, okay.
Finish what he's saying.
Are you cheating me?
She wants to go shopping.
All right, I'll continue a little longer, and then I'll go through the questions, which I'll pass out to you, so it's not really critical if I do the last
Excuse
section at
me,
all.
Michael, they're loving it. Stay with
Okay.
it.
So the inversion of the normal symmetry of familial relations is precipitated by an incapacity for dialogue on the parent's part, and results in an unhealthy, what Kaplan calls a precocious attunement on the child's part. Kaplan summarizes the process elegantly, quote, "Because of these abrupt and unexpected derailments in dialogue, the child becomes a witness to what happened to the parent." Kaplan illustrates the terrifyingly ordinary ways in which children may become possessed by such ghosts. This is a quote from Louise Kaplan, who died last year. The survivor parents unconsciously focus on the issues that were and still are crucial to their salvation. Though the mother still cannot remember her starvation, she transmits the emotional experience of starvation through her preoccupation with buying, preparing, serving, and eating food. The father transmits the physical degradations he endured by being preoccupied with cleanliness and the elimination of feces. When a girl is innocently competing with her mother for her father's attention, the mother may suddenly decide to snip off her daughter's ponytail and send her to school with a crew cut. Of course, when the mother arrived at the camp, that concentration camp, at the same age the daughter is now, that is what her captors did to her. To survive the psychological trauma of her mother's hostile gesture, the daughter develops an unconscious fantasy that she has been selected by her mother to perform a special mission. She and she alone can repair her mother's trauma by sacrificing her own desires and longings. She becomes obese, thus effectively concealing her beauty under layers of fat. Or she starves herself until her body is transformed into the body of a concentration camp prisoner. Rosenman and Handelsman offer the concept of group story, which is very similar to Judy Atkinson's concept of lower, as the social glue that helps bind the people together. The tragedy of the stolen generations, of course, is that the schools were designed to annihilate group identity by eliminating language, ceremonies, beliefs, and rituals, as well as, of course, denying parents the opportunity to become loving mirrors that would validate their children's sense of goodness of self. Rosenman and Handelsman summarize the consequences of the internalization of a bad group story this way. Quote, "Most important, a self-deceiving story forbids trans members to be awakened from their stupor in order to penetrate its mysteries. An unreal Goebbels story tends to freeze the group in time. It impedes mourning over losses and humiliations suffered in catastrophes. Its members are constantly tempted to reenact elements of the catastrophe within the family and group, as well as in relationship with other groups. The question then is, how do we move children from annihilative anxiety and re-traumatization to the possibility of hopefulness and dreaming? Alice Miller, author of The Drama of the Gifted Child, would argue that traumatic reenactment only stops when mourning for the terrible losses of the past is permitted. That leads me to three questions that I also have on this sheet of paper for you. The first one is this: how much do you know of the details of the history of the particular Aboriginal group with whom you work? Is this something you can speak about with the community? What evidence do you see for the transmission of suffering from one generation to the next? The next question: is there a place for the talking through or playing out of emotions, and is there room for mourning in your preschool space? And the third one is, what are your thoughts about the suffering of the children, and where do you turn to for support and healing for yourself when this suffering weighs on you? That is, who takes care of the caretakers? And in my discussion group earlier, I talked about a 4 to 5 year old child I worked with who had what we call self-injurious behavior and cut herself with scissors in school. And when the teacher took the scissors away, she started biting and chewing her arms. And at the end of the year, she wrote a note to the kindergarten teacher to ask her if she could please take her home for the summer. That's a very heavy burden for you or I to carry when we're placed in such terrible positions. And so one of the things I hope you can use these 2 days for is figuring out how to build communities of support, either physical ones with colleagues or virtual ones with people you meet here who may be working in other places. Now, the last part of my paper is a series of 18 questions. I'm just going to read them, and then if you're interested in any of them, I'll pass them out on a sheet of paper for you so that you can discuss them in your group if you like, or take them back to your own setting. First, I call this restorative pedagogical work, and again, this resonates very much with what Judy was speaking about when she was describing a pedagogy built around dance, movement, drama, ceremony, ritual, and healing. Number 1, how can we assist young children in moving from traumatic reenactment and parentified concerns to experience continuity, dreaming, imagination, and possibility? Number 2, is there a space for the wisdom of community elders in building a curriculum, or does curriculum only come down from big buildings and big cities from bureaucrats? Is there room for sympathetic attunement to ancestral memory, spirit, knowledge, earth, and indigenous identity in your school? Is it possible to reanimate ancestral pasts through traditional ritual, performance, dance, music, storytelling, poetry, films, novels, etc.? Can you create a pedagogy that stirs the spirit? Number 5, can you combat lorelessness by building a curriculum that revolves around story making, recognizing especially the importance of group story and the need to not define story in the narrow ways of a Western narrative of storytelling? Is there room for dreaming? Is there room for ancestral and spirit knowledge, for earth knowledge, for artistic knowledge, for knowledge expressed through the hands? Is there a place in your teaching for the kind of restorative listening represented by Dad Deering? Can respect, hope, and love be central pillars of schooling? Can you acknowledge and value the collectivist ethos and origins of Aboriginal experience? Can you take, quote, cultural orphans, and I'm not sure Aboriginal children are cultural orphans, that's probably a view from the outside, but to restore to such children a sense of communality and continuity with ancestral and familial heritage, to assist in restoring genealogical continuity? What if, as a teacher or therapist, you became an analyst? Not an analyst as a psychoanalyst, an analyst as in A-N-N-A-L-I-S-T, a documentarian of the child's unconscious experience, a witness to the child, a chronicler of the ruptures and the possibilities that each child contains within them. If the problem is not about the child's capacities to speak their trauma, maybe the problem is about our inability to hear the trauma that the child is actually speaking to us. How can you increase your attunement to the unspoken aspects of each child's being? 12, is there an opportunity to build space for local dialogue around trauma, reparation, healing, and moving forward? I don't know, maybe I'll skip a few of these. You can read them anyway. Do you accept that psychic trauma that has not been absorbed, processed, or resolved in some way, it lives on in an embodied or disembodied form and travels across generations? And can you interrupt that cycle? Now, there's an expression I use called the dehistoricization of experience, which is the taking away of a person's history, culture, language, ancestry, and beliefs. If dehistoricization of experience is particularly traumatic, how can you assist each child in regaining a foothold in history? Can we place children back into their histories? Is it possible as a teacher or therapist to cultivate receptivity so that the child's story comes out and you can assist the child in rethinking their own experience? Is there a space for the unconscious, the soul, and the spirit in our work with children? I know in the US, the debate about schooling is almost exclusively cognitive, and oftentimes it's cognitive reduced to its stupidest level, but there's not much room for unconscious soul or spirit. Can we expand our idea of knowing to include myth, spirit, tall tales, and forms of truth other than the grand truths of Western curriculum and Western civilization? I'll pass these questions around on paper so you can think about them. Thank you very much.